If you look at the difference between Metro Detroit and the regions around the country, which are far more prosperous, and the same thing is true at the state level, the difference is not that their factory jobs pay more than ours. The difference is that they have a far higher proportion of their workers in professional and managerial occupations.
There's a quote often attributed to Albert Einstein, but honestly, we don't really know where it's from, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Although I love this state and this region of Metro Detroit, I must be honest, under most metrics, competitively, we are not keeping up. Younger adults continue to flow out, and although we are the Motor City, we've struggled to truly diversify beyond that for a number of reasons. Today's episode of Your Daily Detroit, I hope, makes you think. Feedback, as always, dailydetroit@gmail.com. It is Tuesday, April 11th, 2023. I'm J.R. Stays. Let's get started. Joining me virtually is Lou Glazer. He's the president and co-founder of Michigan Future, someone I have wanted to talk to for a while on the show because he's somebody who has had his finger on the pulse of what's happening when it comes to talent attraction, when it comes to how Michigan stands and everything in helping develop Michigan to grow and go forward. So, Lou, welcome to Daily Detroit.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So it seems every few years, the topic of where Michigan stands or Michigan talent attraction or keeping young people in Michigan or attracting them to Michigan, and obviously we're going to tilt this conversation a little to Metro Detroit because that's where we are. But this seems to come up every few years. It seems like it's in the news again. But why does this keep coming up over and over again?
Well, I think the easy answer is we continue to fail. Although I will say the fact that it comes up doesn't mean that anybody's doing anything about it. So, I think you have to separate sort of it being part of a conversation, which I agree it has been from time to time, and actually making it a priority. And we failed to do the latter for decades.
Yeah, because I remember talking about this quite a few Mackinac policy conferences ago with the Detroit Regional Chamber. I've been to a number of events over the years. Earlier this year, I was at an event with Mish Auto with Doug Song, who was really sounding a lot of alarm bells and stuff that if you've traveled around, if you've done work in different cities, as I have, I know you've been studying different cities, it seems abundantly clear, but it feels like it doesn't get through and we keep doing the same song and dance. Where is the conflict here? What's kind of the wall, have you noticed?
Let me first say something about Doug Song, who's terrific. And I think, for your listeners who may not know him, he's the founder of Duo Security, which he recently sold to Cisco. But the reason why I think he has an enormous amount of credibility in this space is Doug has been saying publicly and is willing to say publicly that Duo Security's expansion has primarily been in Austin rather than Ann Arbor or Detroit, because Austin is a place that's concentrating talent and Ann Arbor and Detroit are not. His experience with Duo Security is one of the reasons why this should be a priority. The reason it's not been a priority, in my opinion, is because the state's vision of economic success is still factories. And in a factory-based economy, which is what made Michigan prosperous for most of the 20th century, but will not and cannot in the 21st century, sort of concentration of talent, particularly young talent, doesn't matter. So to me, that's the fundamental challenge that we have is that, are we trying to be a factory-based economy or are we trying to be a knowledge-based economy? As long as we're focused on factories, concentrating talent's not important.
Well, are there some cultural issues there? Because when I talk to people out on the street or I'll do interviews, there are a large number of people who are like, everything's fine. We should be attracting more factory jobs. That's what we're known for. And for me, I look at it and I go, even if you're attracting factory jobs don't look like they did. There's never going to be another day where you see a picture of the old Packer plant or the old Ford Model T plant and those thousands of people coming in because even the nature of factory work has changed.
Correct. Let me do a couple of different ways of unpacking it. Yes, it is true that we have defined ourselves as a place that sort of makes things, particularly makes motor vehicles. The reality is what made Michigan rich for most of the 20th century is not the making, it is the fact that we invented and commercialized both the vehicle and the production process. And believe me, particularly in Metro Detroit, there are far more auto industry jobs that are knowledge-based, that are in pre- and post-production, than there are factory jobs. And for some reason, we value the $40,000 to $50,000 factory job over the $100,000 designer, engineer, headquarter workers, all the rest of the knowledge workers. If what you care about is good-paying jobs in Metro Detroit, the knowledge part of the auto industry is far more important than the factory part of the auto industry. The more jobs, and they pay double.
Could there be a culture clash there? Because, when I talk to people, like somebody who's making 50 or 54, like the state average, versus, say, making six figures, those are different lifestyles.
Yeah, well, but the question is, why don't we want an opportunity for everyone to have high-paid jobs and figure out their own lifestyles? If you look at the difference between Metro Detroit and the regions around the country, which are far more prosperous, and the same thing is true at the state level, the difference is not that their factory jobs pay more than ours. The difference is that they have a far higher proportion of their workers in professional and managerial occupations. And to get back to the sort of retaining and attracting talent theme of this conversation, the reason why these places have more knowledge-based jobs, it's the dual security story, is that they have larger concentrations of adults with a 4-year degree, particularly recent college graduates. This is an economy where talent attracts capital. So from a Michigan Future perspective, our goal has always been a broad middle class. The core of the middle class in America now are professionals and managers. We don't have enough of those jobs. That's where our priority should be. And you cannot get those jobs unless you have a high proportion of adults with a 4-year degree, period.
Yeah, I know we lag behind other states. I know that Metro Detroit does a little bit better than the state average, I think, but it's still not as comparative. And then you get into the city of Detroit, it's way down there.
Yeah, exactly. Particularly young professionals are way over concentrated in big metros and the central city in the big metro. So that Detroit's a little above the national average is sort of irrelevant. We're way behind the leading edge regions, and the state's way behind the leading edge states in terms of the proportion of adults with a 4-year degree. And part of that is fewer of the kids who grow up in Michigan get 4-year degrees, but also we are still a net exporter of recent college graduates. There was just a really interesting new study that got some national press that compared at the state level the number of recent college graduates living in a state compared to those who graduated from the state. Michigan's minus 12%. Minnesota, which is a state that we sort of have compared Michigan to for years, largely because they're not on the coast and they're a cold weather state, so that takes those two things off the table as excuses. They're plus 8. Now, the leading states are New York and Colorado, which are plus 40. But Michigan cannot have a prosperous economy for minus 12. And at the moment, as far as I know, there's no policymaker thinking about what to do about that.
Why is it being ignored? Because it seems like it's being ignored by both sides of the aisle, honestly.
No question. It's bipartisan. I'm not saying that our theory of why it's being ignored is right, but our theory is that it doesn't matter if your goal is recruiting battery planes.
So are our leaders looking for or searching for the wrong things?
Yes. I mean, for folks who are interested, our website is michiganfuture.org. There's a post that I did recently on comparing General Motors in 1979 to General Motors today, and then what they think they're going to be in 2030, trying to make the case that the state needs General Motors' 2030 economic development strategy. The problem is that Michigan's, on a bipartisan basis, our vision and strategy is General Motors 1979. So General Motors in 79 is America's largest employer. They have a little more than 600,000 workers. 450,000 are factory workers, are union jobs. Today, it's 45,000. and they have more white-collar workers than blue-collar workers. And all their expansion as they transition to sort of what they're framing as a mobility industry rather than the auto industry is going to be on the professional and managerial knowledge side, not on the factory side. They're almost certainly, as they electrify the vehicles, going to have fewer factory workers. So we've got an outdated economic strategy, and the strategy that we have, or vision, is not dependent on talent concentrations.
So what are a few ways to change this? Because when I talk to listeners, some listeners who have moved in, some listeners who have moved to other cities, they state very clear things that I don't know if sometimes lots of people know that are factors. So they'll state things like transit, they'll state things like walkability, they'll state things like amenities or various things to do to connect them to the place that they are. I mean, part of the reason, heck, that we started this podcast was to connect people to things that maybe they didn't know about in Metro Detroit so that hopefully they stay interested and stay here. I mean, it's not just because I like to talk on a microphone. And so to me, it feels like there's a big disconnect. So what are some of the things that could be done? And it could be at any, kind of leadership level to help change this.
You listed the three most important. I mean, your listeners are exactly right. The characteristic of places that are talent magnets, particularly young talent magnets, are characterized by transit walkability and high amenities. I mean, along with sort of high-density mixed-use neighborhoods kinds of things. So we know what it looks like. I mean, we know the difference between, Brooklyn and Detroit. If you want to use Brooklyn as sort of the example of where over the last decade or so, sort of young professionals have really concentrated. We know the difference between Minneapolis and Detroit. We know the difference between, Madison and Lansing. We know the difference between, it's sort of not the right comparison, but we know the difference between Denver and Grand Rapids. There are a set of sort of quality of place characteristics that clearly are transit-led that have been the formula around the country for concentrating talent. And we've just chosen not to invest in any of that stuff here.
Yeah, I will note for listeners that our population density, I was looking at a recent report from SMART, the bus system, looking at population density. And what I found interesting was they have a really hard job to do what they do because so many people are spread out so far and so many jobs are spread everywhere. And you only have a few select cities. Like there are of course, some dense blocks and things in the city of Detroit, but on average, it's not that kind of density that you're talking about. And if you look at high density places in the region, they're far and few between. And they're places that might surprise folks like Grosse Pointe Park or Ferndale or parts of Royal Oak, not all, but parts. Like it's interesting to see that the dense parts aren't necessarily in the city. I was reporting recently for public television that, and restaurant owners are really frustrated because their interest in Birmingham, they're doing okay because there's residents nearby, but downtown, because, with all the office cuts, it's not been rebounding, in part because we don't really have that many residents in greater downtown.
Amen. This is a lesson that we should have learned 20 years ago when, pre-pandemic, but it's certainly true post-pandemic. Successful downtowns are first and foremost high-density residential neighborhoods, period. So if your downtown is not a place where people live, you're not going to have a successful downtown. This sprawl that we have sort of spread out all over the place is sort of a conscious choice that Metro Detroit has made, and I think by and large the whole state has made. The lever that is the most powerful in creating density is rail transit, because you end up getting development around the transit stops. And Metro Detroit has been anathema to thinking, the whole state, but particularly Metro Detroit's been anathema to thinking about that. So we've chosen to sprawl. We've chosen what Chris Lineberger calls drivable suburbanism rather than walkable urbanism. And the consequence of that is that you end up with a region that's characterized by low density, and young people, but particularly young college graduates, before they have kids, are way over-concentrated in high-density neighborhoods. That's the main reason for the -12.
But you also look at successful areas that have a variety of things for people. I mean, it's not just about people who don't have kids. But if you look at like greater Chicagoland and things like that, there are different options for different lifestyles. And even if you think residential, in the city of Detroit, you look at some neighborhoods. I'm a few blocks away from the Fisher Building, and you can see 5 lots behind my house, and it was a neighborhood that was full of houses. And yet we're not infilling like that. We will do one like low income, or we'll do a apartment block and be like, oh, that's great. But that's nowhere near what that neighborhood used to be in any way, shape, or form.
I think that's exactly right. So from our perspective, the lesson that we should be learning from successful regions, and regions really matter more than states, and cities matter more than states, is we need to be creating walkable, high-amenity neighborhoods with lots of transit. And if you get that, you will get high-density development, and you will get mixed-use development. So what matters is the neighborhood, not the individual development project. And we're having a very hard time in Michigan understanding that, and a very hard time in Michigan in investing in creating walkable neighborhoods, high-density neighborhoods. And it's not just money, it's also sort of the regulatory system. It's still hard to do high-density mixed-use neighborhoods. I mean, we're largely zoned for single-family housing all the place. So there's a regulatory agenda and a public investment agenda, both of which we're not doing. And because we're not doing it, we're paying the price of now being a low-prosperity region and a low-prosperity state. The thing I didn't mention about 1979 is Michigan was one of the more prosperous states in the country there. So this is the example we've been using. Our per capita income was 3% above the national average. Massachusetts was 2% above. So we were more prosperous than Massachusetts. Today, Michigan is 12% below. Massachusetts is 30% above.
This pushback I've seen a lot. Like, 1, transit is not our culture. 2, it involves a lot of change. And 3, they view transit as something that poor people take. Like, I have seen that culturally here a lot. And among our audience, I think there's some agreement. I mean, obviously there's dissent everywhere, but you go out into more and more places. You talk out into the suburbs, different places, even in the city, quite honestly, because the city is still, even though we have such a high percentage of carless households in the city of Detroit, it's still car crazy. And it's not that, say, like, people are going to like delete cars or maybe have less cars than they had before. They could function as a household with maybe 1 car instead of 2. What do you say to someone like that who says, well, I could just buy a car for cheap and this is what I'm going to do? And it's almost like an impedance mismatch where, well, this is where the country is going. This is where businesses are going. This is where talent's going. And then it feels like a lot of times when it comes to parts of Metro Detroit, it's let's do the exact opposite. And sometimes, to be fair to leaders, they end up reflecting their audiences. So if you look at a Warren, there is nothing in Warren about living in Warren that you look at and go urban and dense. And when the mayor tries to do a downtown proposal, whatever the merits of the individual proposal, it's something that's very, very different to them. Or you look at density in, say, Livonia. There was the idea of putting some apartment buildings and people were mad it was going to be in the view of their single family houses. It's almost like, from a policy perspective, we take every step, and this is my own editorialization, but we take every step to not go where the country's going. And as somebody who's watched this for 20 years, it's really frustrating.
Yes. So this factory-dominant economic vision is voter-led, not elected official-led. So I agree with that. I mean, I think voters in Metro Detroit and the broader state have been pretty clear that they don't want transit. I would say 3 things, and I don't think we say it loudly enough, is 1, not having transit makes you poorer as a region. You have fewer good-paying job opportunities. 2nd, it means that you're not going to see your grandkids because a lot of your kids are going to go to places that do have transit. The -12 is real.
Yeah.
That means fewer kids growing up here stay here. So that's a consequence. And the 3rd thing I'd say is the sort of the car culture, sort of being oriented around autos is not just true in Detroit. I mean, there's, it's true across in most of the country. And yet, places like Phoenix, Dallas, Denver, Los Angeles have all made major investments, and nobody thinks of those places as dense cities kind of thing. They've all made big investments in rail transit, which was led by the business community, which has been completely missing here. I agree with your assessment that it's voters, not leaders, who are largely determining sort of no transit. But other regions have overcome that reluctance because the business community has been willing to make the case that this is imperative to the future prosperity of Metro Detroit and of the state of Michigan. That case has never been made here.
I think you're right. And some people might say, well, the Q line, but honestly, that project
The Q
was
line
scaled.
is not
No, it's not. If it had reached Ferndale or something in its first leg,
exactly.
then it would have been a sign that we're looking at doing something bigger.
Yes, no question. Look, even the downtown Portland streetcar from the 1970s was, it was city only, but it was much better design. So design matters, but also the speed matters. The Q line is so slow, it's just not real transit.
Well, and it's kind of indicated by its funding source now, right? It's now been moved to being funded by tourism dollars.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Recently, the state legislature changed things where part of the hotel taxes and things and bar taxes for visitors ends up going to help subsidize the Q line, I think to the tune of $5 million a year.
Right. So both the people mover and the Q line cannot be considered to be real transit systems.
I think a lot of people would agree with you on that one. So we realized and kind of identified that it's, we've got to move the general population and not just the leaders towards things. I think there's kind of like this misperception that it's the leaders always in the way. How do we reach out? How do we start to change that conversation? Because it's been a long time that this has been an issue.
Yep. No question. Well, so obviously if I knew the answer to that, we would have been doing it for the last 20 years. The one encouraging piece of news is that the millennials and Generation Z value everything we've been talking about a lot more than Generation X and the boomers kind of thing. So the first thing is for them to vote in larger numbers. If the electorate looked more like 45 and under than 45 and older, transit would be a lot higher on the priority list. But the second thing is that, like I said, in every other region, the business community and other leaders are going to have to get actively engaged in saying, look, you may not care about whether there's high quality transit in the region. Your lives may not be organized around it. But if this region is going to be a place with lots of good paying job opportunities for your kids and grandkids, transit is essential, and no one is making that case.
Yeah. Well, you've given me a lot to think about, and I think listeners a lot to think about. People want to help you. If people want to support what you're doing, if they want to learn more, what can they do? You got a website, other things going on?
Yep. So everything's at michiganfuture.org, to get our thinking and our research and sort of our ideas. Certainly encourage people to sign up for the newsletter there. In terms of what people can do to help sort of push this walkable urbanism agenda, the single most important thing is to start talking to your local and state elected officials. They almost never hear from people that this is a priority. And it's much more powerful coming from voters than it is from organizations like Michigan Future. So instead of trying to work through us to get it done, just send an email, send a text, make a call. If you get a chance, talk one-on-one with the folks that represent you, both in the city, but also in Lansing. Then if you're really interested, start to organize pro-walkable urbanism groups that can sort of multiply the voices that are basically saying this is a priority.
Yeah, and I've said this before on the show. It's local is where you can make the most impact. A lot of the media conversation focuses on the national stuff and whatever, and I understand the people getting upset and into it, but when it comes to local stuff, it's not just that local leaders sometimes never hear about this. I've talked to local leaders who sometimes hear about nothing because so many people are focused up the chain. And I think about a state senator who recently decided not to run for U.S. senator. And the reason was because it's so much more interesting and so much more change could happen in Lansing. And I think that's true with Lansing. I also would say as a pro tip, whatever topic you're on, whether you agree with what we're talking about or disagree or are passionate about something completely different, talk to the municipality in which you live. So
I agree.
So I see a lot of people who are in the suburbs, and it's great to be interested in the city of Detroit, but talk to your city suburb because you're a resident there, and you'll have a lot more impact on saying, hey, even if you live in a small one, say, hey, I want to work together to make this happen, to have these things accessible. I want to raise up my community because I understand it's really sexy to be like, let's go at Detroit. But you know what? Detroit residents can handle this conversation. If you're a Detroit resident, go ahead and step up and do that. But if you're in Pleasant Ridge, if you're in Birmingham, if you're in wherever, right? It doesn't matter. Wayne, I'll just Taylor, talk to people who are where you're at, and you're going to have so much more impact than as somebody who talks as someone who is not part of that community.
Amen. It's not just cities that need to be more walkable, it's the suburbs too. So I agree with that 100%.
Well, Lou Glazer, MichiganFuture.org. Thank you so much for spending some time with us on Daily Detroit.
My pleasure.
A little tough love today. If you've got feedback, thoughts, dailydetroit@gmail.com. As always, local media requires local support. We don't have an out-of-town funder. We're not part of a big, media conglomerate. It's us, some microphones, some love, and a lot of work. So, patreon.com/dailydetroit. With that, I am Jer Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around Detroit. Talk tomorrow.